Record. And good evening, everybody. It is great to be back. Just a word ahead of time. By the way, you probably want to put it on speaker view so that you'll see my my slides better as opposed to Brady Bunch view. I think they call that gallery view. As always, we'll have some questions and answers at the end. But I have so much material tonight that I don't want to roll over to next week because I want to start talking about evidence for the Bible, that if I run out of time at the end, and when we have our Q&A and then a closing prayer and whatever announcements that Matt has, after people that need to leave, I'm going to keep going and record till the end. So you're welcome to stay to the end or to watch the recording later. But today we're going to pick up where we left off last week, and I'm going to share my screen now. That probably isn't what I want. There we go. Do you see the my Apologetics header page there? Yep. Thumbs up some. Yes. All right. Thank you. All right. So we're going to talk today about some more scientific evidence for God. And I'm not really going to review class 1 very much, but we're going to talk about, has science replaced the need for God? Scientific evidence for God. Let me make this a little bit bigger where I can see. I'm sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulties here. There we go. All right, great. And then we're going to talk about scientific evidence for God, specifically evidence from the universe, fine-tuning, and then evidence from the first life on Earth. And last week, if you remember, we defined a few terms. We talked about the fact that science is our friend. It actually illuminates God. It points us to God and gives us reasons to believe. And that historically, scientists have been people of faith. And then we looked specifically at the Big Bang, the creation of the universe, a little less than 14 billion years ago, based on current calculations. And there was a lot of information there. Here's what I need you to remember. There was nothing, no time, space, anything, and then in an instant, there was everything. That everything was created from nothing, and it all points to God. There is no naturalistic explanation. The details you can look up if you don't remember some of the things we talked about, but that's the point. It points to God. I want a couple of words of caution for believers. Sometimes we're accused of using God of the gaps arguments. Have you ever heard God of the gaps? By the way, I have you all where I can see your little boxes now, so you can wave at me or raise your hand. And if you've heard that, what's the God of the gaps argument? X happens. We don't know how X happens, therefore God must have caused it. You know, I don't know how this happened, so it was God. In other words, there's a gap in our knowledge, and we fill it with God. The problem with that is that given enough time, things that we don't understand, we do understand, and we had plugged God in that gap. Now God gets squeezed out, and pretty soon it seems like there's no need for God at all. And we don't need to call things miracles that aren't miracles. You know, I just had a grandbaby. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to find a way to get into any class, and we talk about the miracle of childbirth. But childbirth is not a miracle. It's a natural process. Now, God created it, and it's wondrous. It's amazing, but it's not a miracle. And so don't get me wrong. I'm not putting God out of the picture, but we don't want to plug God in miraculously unless we're really, really certain that he belongs there. We're going to talk about scientific arguments that I use that are really different. What we're going to talk about is not things we don't understand, but things that science has shown us what we do understand. We find things that we know. We use math to calculate the probabilities. We find out, hey, the odds of this happening are infinitesimally small. There is no naturalistic explanation. Therefore, God is the best explanation of the evidence. Let me give you an example. Let's say that Patrice wins the lottery next week, the Powerball lottery. The odds are 292 million to 1. That's pretty amazing. Is it miraculous? No. But what if she wins 3 weeks in a row? Well, we know it wouldn't happen. Not because it's impossible, although it is, but because after the second week, the police would show up at her door. We wouldn't say she's really lucky, would say the evidence points to the fact that she cheated. Is it theoretically possible that someone could win 3 weeks in a row? Of course, but you would have to check your brain out to think that a 1 chance in 10 to the 25th power was going to happen by luck. The evidence points to Patrice cheating, which of course she didn't do because she's a disciple.
Amen.
All right. So a second caution for believers is beware of bogus evidence. There's a lot of evidence for God floating around, I put in air quotes, that just isn't true. How many people have discovered Noah's Ark? They haven't discovered Noah's Ark. They're not going to. I write about this in my book. You'll get that when I send it to you, which I didn't this week. But I want to give one example, and you may have heard it. It's been floating around since at least 1969. I first saw it about 40 years ago. And it goes like this. NASA was doing some calculations and discovered a missing day in the Earth's chronology, thus proving where it says in Joshua chapter 10 that Joshua and his army were able to fight an extra day because God made the sun stand still. Now, of course, this is a ridiculous story. First of all, how would they know a day was missing? We measure the Earth in billions of years. They wouldn't know one day here and there. Yet this story has been in church bulletins for decades, and now it floats around the internet, and I've heard Christians repeat it. Look, there's plenty of good evidence for God. We don't have to use dumb things like that. If you see something that sounds too good to be true, do a little research. I wish I had time to give some more examples, but I don't. So let's get back to scientific evidence for God. Remember, I promised you last week, we're going to answer the argument science has replaced the need for God and for religion. And if you listen to a debate, this is very common for atheists to open with. They say, look, religion served its purpose thousands of years ago. People didn't know where thunder and lightning came from, so the gods were angry. And where does the sun go to at night? Well, the gods are sleeping. And why do the crops go away in winter? Well, the gods are on vacation. And the volcano erupts because the volcano god is angry because we haven't fed it a virgin lately, which, if you ask me, that society would produce a lot of 12 and 13-year-old girls looking to get active way sooner than they should because they don't want to go in a volcano. But where did all the plants and animals come from? Well, God made them. And so they say, well, now we know what volcanoes are and what lightning and thunder is. And religion filled those gaps then, but we don't need it now. The gaps in our knowledge are gone. We don't need to fill God in those gaps because we have science. Now, that's not a valid argument. If we had the time to interact, I would ask you guys some questions about this and ask you why it's not. I'm just going to tell you. It's a bogus argument. It's what's called a straw man argument or straw man fallacy. And if you're not familiar with the straw man argument, what it is you build up a case for your opponent that doesn't represent what he or she really believes, and you build up a weak case, and then you tear it down. Do you know of any Christians that are Christians because they want to know where lightning came from? No, it's not what Christians or Jews believe. In fact, it completely misdefines the Christian faith. I defy anyone to find a verse anywhere in the New or the Old Testament that shows that it's there, that either testament is there to explain the physical world to us. Even Genesis chapter 1, the creation story, is not trying to explain the physical world. It's debunking that view. And I wish we had time to study out Genesis 1, but what God is doing when it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and it talks about all the things that he's made. See, the nations surrounding Israel believed that the sun was God, the moon was God, the stars were God. They had all these gods. And Genesis 1 says, no, there's one God, and he made the sun, the moon, the stars. There's not many gods. There's one God, and he made all those things. It's actually debunking that view. See, science has one purpose: to try to explain the physical world. Religion has a completely different purpose: to explain the metaphysical world. Christianity doesn't try and do science job, and science shouldn't try and do Christianity's job, because it's powerless to answer the most important questions in life. I'm not anti-science. I love science. There's a lot of science books behind me. In fact, I read 350 pages of Molecular and Cell Biology for Dummies. And you can't be a dummy, and even that book is really deep. But the purpose of religion, the purpose of Christianity is to answer the most important questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What's my purpose? Where am I going? What will happen after I die? And religion answers those two questions by answering these questions. Who is God? And how can I have a relationship with the God who made me? See, those are the gaps that science fills, which religion fills, that science can't begin to address. I love science. It's a great tool, but you got to use the right tool for the job. Any mechanic knows that. If I decide I want to fix my cell phone with a hammer, I'm going to have a problem. And trying to answer life's most important questions with science is like trying to fix my smartphone with a hammer. Saying science can replace religion is like saying clothes can replace food. Let's compare the Bible's answers to science's answers for life's most important questions. And really, we're not talking about science. What we're talking about is naturalism, the belief that the only thing that exists is the physical world. There is nothing beyond the physical world. Science is really agnostic toward religion. It can illuminate some things. We're going to talk about that today, but it really doesn't. We're talking about scientism or naturalism, the belief that that's all there is. So, what is naturalism's answers to the most important question? Who am I? An accidental collection of atoms formed by completely random processes. You and I are no more significant than a monkey or a rat or a bacterium or a tree or a rock or Pluto, the cartoon dog, or the planet. That's who I am based on naturalism. Why am I here? What's my purpose? It's a nonsense question. You have no purpose. It's an illogical question to ask. It's like asking, what is the purpose of a rock? What is the purpose of the moon? There's no purpose. People have no purpose. Where do I go after I die? Your atoms will decay and become food for other animals and plants. Your consciousness, if there even is such a thing, will cease to exist. You'll be like your dog Rover, dead all over. And is there a God, and what does he want from me? How can I have a relationship with him? Again, it's a nonsense question because there is no such person. Now, what about Christianity's answers to those questions? Number one, who am I? God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. Who are we? We're creatures made by God in his image. Psalm 139, I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Deuteronomy 7, you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. Who am I? I am someone important. Made by the God who created the universe in his own image, fearfully and wonderfully made, God's treasured possession. It's better than a collection of useless atoms. Why am I here? What is my purpose? Well, 2 Corinthians 5 tells us that we were created to live with God in heaven. And I won't read this verse here. I'll send you the PowerPoint. But I think if you've been a Christian for a while, hopefully you know this passage well because it's one of the most incredible passages. God created you and me so that we could spend eternity with him in heaven. Later in the chapter, in verse 14, it says that Christ's love compels us. We're convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died, and he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, now we do so no longer. The old is gone. If anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us what? The ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting sins, the sins of people against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We're therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. So what's my purpose? Why am I here? I'm an ambassador for God himself. I was created so I'd spend eternity with him, And once I have a relationship with him, my purpose is to help other people have a relationship with him. What is more significant than changing another person's eternal destiny? Does my life matter? Well, if you consider changing where someone's going to spend forever and ever important, absolutely. What happens when I die? Well, Revelation 21 is such an amazing passage describing heaven. And of course, it uses language we can understand. I doubt that heaven's going to look exactly the way Revelation describes it. But look at what it says. No more death, no mourning, no crying, no pain. The old order of things has passed away. I'm making everything new. To the thirsty, I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. To those who are victorious, they'll inherit all this. I will be their God and they will be my children. That's a whole lot better than being food for the animals and decomposing. Is there a God and can I have a relationship with him? Absolutely. And he proved that by sending Jesus Christ, taking the form of a human being, dying a death, raising from the dead, that we can all have a relationship with God as long as we do it on his terms. And what does he want from me? He wants me to love him. He loves us and wants love in return, wants us to be in fellowship with him. He said the two greatest commands are to love him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love other people, his children, as we love ourselves. Now, which of those two worldviews, naturalism or Christianity, provides more satisfying answers? I'm a meaningless bag of molecules with no purpose, no identity, and no future, or I'm a child of the all-powerful, all-loving God who made me in his image, wants to have a relationship with me, and has given me the most important job on the planet. Now, let's be clear. The fact that science has no answers for the important questions doesn't prove that God exists, but it absolutely does prove that science has not replaced the need for God. It can't. It couldn't possibly. You may have heard this one. I won't believe in God unless you can prove it to me scientifically. Once again, it's a bogus argument. What is scientific proof? The scientific method, which Sir Francis Bacon came up with. I told you last week how much I like bacon. It's where you repeat an experiment under controlled conditions and get the exact same result over and over and over again. That's the scientific method of proof. The only thing that can truly be proven is things with logic and things with math. You can't prove God scientifically because you can't experiment on him. But then again, you can't prove almost everything you and I believe using the scientific method either. You can't prove evolution. You can't prove that the universe came into existence. You can't prove Pluto exists. You can't prove that you exist by the scientific method. So it's a bogus question. Now, let's talk about evidence for God from science. I want to start with some quotes. Well, we're talking about the fine-tuning of the universe next. And there's 4 kinds of fine-tuning of the universe. I got my notes a little bit out of order here. Oh, I see what happened. My page slid down and I started reading the next page of my notes. But when people ask you, will you prove God scientifically for me? Ask this question. If I could show you convincing scientific proof that God exists, would you follow him? If they say no, or they go, well, I wouldn't follow God, then you know that's not the real issue. And again, in coming weeks, we're going to talk more about how to ask questions to get to the real issue. But a lot of times when people bring up an objection, you say, if I can answer that to your satisfaction, will you believe? Will you become a Christian? They'll probably say no. And then you get to talk some more and find out what the real issue is. All right, so fine-tuning of the universe. There's 4 kinds of fine-tuning that we could talk about. We're going to touch on a few of these here, but I want to get to some quotes for some world-renowned scientists who happen to be atheists and agnostic. You notice last week I only quoted atheists and agnostics. I read 4 books on the Big Bang just to write that one chapter in my book. 3 of the 4 were from people who did not believe in God. Most of the books that I read, most of the research I do is from unbelievers because I don't want it to be tainted toward what I want to believe. All right, let's look at these quotes. Stephen Hawking, most of us have heard of him. He said the laws of science as we know them at present contain many fundamental numbers like the size of the electric charge of the electron, the ratio of the masses of the proton and electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been finely adjusted, very finely adjusted, to make possible the development of life. He's not just an atheist, he's a hardcore atheist. Sir Martin Rees said, wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. He's won at least 15 scientific awards, including the Templeton Prize. David Deutsch, if anyone claims not to be surprised by these special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. Leonard Suskin, he says if you were to change the laws of physics even a little bit, the world as we know it wouldn't exist. Steven Weinberg says how surprising it is that the laws of nature and the initial conditions of the universe should allow for the existence of beings who could observe it. Life as we know it would be impossible if any one of several physical quantities had slightly different values. We're going to come back to this guy a little bit later. And then Paul Davies says, for me, there's powerful evidence that there's something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. Notice he said somebody. The impression of design is overwhelming. And then Paul Davies said elsewhere, the really amazing thing is not that life on Earth is balanced on a knife edge, but the entire universe is balanced on a knife edge and would be total chaos if any of the natural constants were off even slightly. Even if you dismiss man as a chance happening, the fact remains that the universe seems unreasonably suited to the existence of life, almost contrived, you might say, a put-up job. Each of these 6 men is a world-famous scientist, tops of their fields. 5 are atheists, 1 is an agnostic, and they're all saying, even though they don't believe in God, there's no good reason to believe that the conditions that exist for life should be there. We're going to talk about that in more detail. In fact, every science, this isn't even controversial. The fine-tuning is not controversial. The reason for it is, but the fine-tuning itself, everybody agrees. Every atheist scientist. No, I've heard people that are not scientists argue against the fine-tuning because they didn't know what they were talking about. Now, we're only going to look at a few laws and constants of the universe, but there are more than 30. One guy says there's more than 150, but it's generally agreed upon there's about 3 dozen that if they changed the teensiest, weensiest bit, you and I wouldn't exist. Now, I'm not saying that we'd have Star Trek aliens instead of us, Vulcans and Hortas, that come from a silicon-based life form. I'm saying there would be no life of any kind anywhere in the universe. And I'm not just saying that. All the scientists say it. So we're just going to look at 9 of them very quickly. Who you see here is Sir Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal of Great Britain, a professor at Cambridge, not a bad school. He wrote a book called Just 6 Numbers and said if these 6 numbers were just the teeniest bit different, there would be no life. Remember, this guy's an atheist. And you can see the 6 there. The first one, epsilon, measure of nuclear efficiency, doesn't really matter. You can look up what it is. The actual value is 0.007. If it were 0.006, the entire universe would be only hydrogen, not a very interesting universe. And if it were 0.008, all the protons would have fused together at the Big Bang, and there'd be no hydrogen. If there's no hydrogen, guess what? There's no, what else there isn't? Stars. No stars, no you and me. Secondly, N, the ratio of the electromagnetic force to the strength of gravity. If it was changed by 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, according to Paul Davies and Sir Martin Rees, there would be 0 chance for life. Well, how big is 10 to the 40th power? And if you looked at the YouTube video I made, my first one, which was not very professional, I don't have the best graphics in the world, you already heard this illustration. But let me illustrate 10 to the 40th power. Cover North America with one layer of dimes laid flat. And if you did that, you would have 7.5 quadrillion dollars. Even our government hasn't spent that much yet. Now, that's not 10 to the 40th power. So take those dimes, stack them to the moon. Quarter of a million miles away, you still don't have 10 to the 40th power. What you're going to do is you're going to mark one dime with a Sharpie, blindfold Matt, and send him wandering between here and the moon, and he picks out the right dime on the first try. 1 trillion times in a row. That's one chance in 10 to the 40th power. That's just one of these constants. All right, let's look at the next value quickly. Omega, the mass density of the universe, 1 second after the Big Bang. And if it was bigger or smaller by one chance at 10 to the 15th, that's a quadrillion, or a million times a billion. If you had that much money and you spent $1 million a day, it would take you 300 million years to spend that much money. That's how finely tuned Omega is. Lambda, we're going to skip that and come back to it. Next, the strong nuclear force. If that was plus or minus a couple percentage, no life. We'll skip that one. Number 5, the mass difference between the proton and the neutron. Protons and neutrons almost weigh exactly the same, but if they were different by 1 part in 700, we'd never get a stable hydrogen-burning star, which means you and I wouldn't exist. I don't expect you to remember any of this, but you're going to get the point. Stephen Hawking, we're back to our friend Steve. If the rate of the expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have collapsed before it ever reached its present size. 100,000 million is 1 part in 10 to the 17th power. So if it expanded faster by that much, stars and galaxies wouldn't have formed. And if it expanded slower than that by one chance in 10 to the 17th, it would have collapsed back in on itself. Well, what is one chance in 10 to the 17th? Let's say that sometime in the next 100 years, a bus is going to come. And if you were early or late by 1 part in 10 to the 17th power, you miss the bus. How much can you miss it by? 1 millionth of a second in the next 100 years. That's fine tuning. Gravitational force, stronger by 1 part at 10 to the 40th, we only get red dwarf stars. Weaker by 1 part in 10 to the 40th, only blue giant stars. And science folks tell us you can't have a life-supporting planet around either of those type of a star. You can go visit one sometime and check it out for yourself. The electromagnetic force, once again, plus or minus by 1 chance in 10 to the 40th. Chemical bonding is disrupted. You either can't get anything bigger than boron or no chemical bonding at all. No chemistry, no us. We are made of chemistry. Number 9, this is the last one of the 9, the cosmological constant, the one that is called lambda. This is dark energy. If you remember those guys in 1998 that I talked about last week, who said that the universe was accelerating and they won the Nobel Prize. What they won the Nobel Prize for was discovering dark energy, what had been called by Einstein the cosmological constant. It is a force that's the opposite of gravity. It repels things from one another. I'm certain that I was surrounded by it in high school, which explains why no girl would talk to me. But if the universe were greater, or if this force, this cosmological constant, say it 3 times fast, were greater or less by 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, no life in the universe. Now remember, the total number of particles, all the protons, neutrons, and electrons added together in the universe is only 10 to the 80th power. And to let you know how big that is, 1 teaspoon of water, do you know how many atoms are in 1 teaspoon of water? 10 to the 23rd power. So 10 to the 80th is such a big number when you get 10 to the 23rd out of that. Now, remember I said we were going to come back to our friend Steven Weinberg, Nobel Prize winning scientist. I listened to a talk that he gave, and this was his last sentence in the talk. The world needs to wake up from its long nightmare of religious belief, and anything that we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may in fact, in the end, be our greatest contribution to civilization. This guy says, if I could make people stop believing in God, that would be better than the Nobel Prize I won. That's how anti-religious this guy is. But this is what he said about the cosmological constant. The existence of life of any kind seems to require a cancellation between different contributions to the vacuum energy accurate to about 120 decimal places. This means that if the energies of the Big Bang were, in arbitrary units, not one and all those zeros, 120 zeros and a zero, instead a 1, 120 zeros and a 1, there would be no life of any sort in the universe. This is a guy that's so anti-religion, he says he wishes he could wipe it off the face of the earth more than he wishes he could win another Nobel Prize. And yet he readily admits that life really shouldn't exist. Sometimes we forget that scientists are people just like you and me. We think that they're rational people, but they're no more rational than you and I. We believe what we want to believe, and then we look for reasons to believe it. That's a human thing. And I want to make sure that you and I don't do that, that we question what we believe, that we don't just accept something because someone told us, that we do our own homework. Now, there are other constants out there, but these 9, if we assume that all of them are equally likely, all of these values, the odds of just these 9 are 1 chance in 10 to the 278th power. Well, remember, all the particles in the universe is 10 to the 80th. So what we have to do to get to 278th power? Well, you mark that 1 electron with the tiniest red Sharpie. We send Matt back out because he's got nothing better to do. And to pick it out twice in a row, send him out into the universe to pick the right electron. And then after he's done and he comes back, he has to win that lottery 14 weeks in a row. Now, that's only 9 of the 3 dozen constants. We're not going to talk about any of these for good reason. We don't have time, and I don't understand all of them. But you look at all of those. There's a bunch of them. And I'm just scrolling them through the screen that are finely tuned. But I want to talk about one other that is mind-blowing to the point where I can't even make up a numeric illustration for it. This is Sir Roger Penrose. I love this guy. He's an atheist, but he's a very honest atheist. His reason for not believing in God is because he wants mathematical solutions. He's not opposed to God. It's just not where he wants to land. But he calculated that the initial entropy at the universe at the Big Bang was tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. It's not a 1 with 123 zeros. It's a 1 followed by 10 to the 123rd power, which means the exponent is more than all the particles in the universe. And in fact, this is what he said about it. I'm not going to take time to read the quote, but he basically says if you wrote a number on every particle in the universe, you couldn't even write the number down. And he says that's how finely it's tuned. And I wish we had time to talk a little bit more about that, but we don't. All right. John Barrow and Frank Tipler, I was going to grab that book. I didn't. The Anthropic Cosmological Principle. I have not finished that book. It is a hard read. It's a big, thick book. And the 2 authors were atheists. And they came to the conclusion from all of the evidence the universe was built for you and me, that it was built on purpose for humans to exist, and they didn't believe in God. We're going to come back later to what their explanation was. Dr. Robert Griffiths, another world-famous scientist, said if we need an atheist for a debate, I go to the philosophy department because the physics department isn't much use. Apparently at Carnegie Mellon, his co-workers are honest enough to say, look, the evidence points to God. I realize that there are a lot of unbelieving scientists, and I don't know if he was using hyperbole or not, but the point is well made. If you're a physicist, you have to believe there's a God. So let's get back to our cross-examination. What do the non-believers account for this? You can't deny that it's there. So they have to have an explanation. So there's a 15-minute thing out there on YouTube, an interview with Leonard Suskin, wonderful interview. He's a really cool guy. He's one of the fathers of string theory, which according to Sheldon Cooper isn't true. But he was interviewed by PBS, and they asked him about this. And he said, well, there's really only three explanations. Number one is God. And then him and the interviewer just laughed. And they didn't say anything. He goes, God. And they kind of went, and then they moved on. Number two, chance, dumb luck. And he says very few scientists believe this because you look at the numbers, it's not scientific to believe in chance. So he dismissed it as stretching credulity. And he says very, very few scientists would say chance. Now, there's a third that he also mentioned. And well, actually, he didn't mention it because scientists don't believe in it. It's called physical necessity. In other words, there are no other possible options. It had to be that way. But scientists know that these numbers didn't have to be that way. They could have taken many other. I mean, the Big Bang could have had larger or smaller energy. There's a near infinite number of possibilities. So that's not a very popular answer, even among unbelieving scientists. Now, there are two others that we'll talk about for a minute that Suskin didn't talk about. The theory of everything. You'll hear scientists sometimes talk about the theory of everything. And what it basically says is, we don't know why yet, but someday we're going to discover the theory of everything, and then we'll figure it out. In other words, you've heard of God of the gaps? This is atheism of the gaps. We don't know what the answer is, but it can't be God, so we'll find it someday. It's just a wish. It's religion. It's atheism of the gaps. Superman time travel. Do you remember I said that Barrow and Tipler said the universe was created for man, but they were atheists? The conclusion in their book was that in the far future, humans become so technologically advanced that they figure out how to travel back in time and create the universe so that it will eventually create them. I wish I could hear you guys laughing. You should be laughing because it's so nonsensical. They say our faith is unreasonable, believe that Jesus rose from the dead. That's beyond unreasonable. But if you've got no God and believe that the universe was created for man, you got to come up with something. So the one that most scientists point to today, and the one that Suskin points to, is the multiverse. And this has really grown in popularity in recent years. And what they say is, ours is not the universe, ours is a universe. There are an infinite number, or which isn't really possible for logical reasons we won't get into. So you say a near infinite number of universes, all with different characteristics, and we just happen to be the lucky ones that are in the one that does support life. Now, because if you've got an infinite number, at least one of them would have this combination of all of those factors that we talked about. In fact, Sandra Faber, who is a professor at Cal and an atheist, said one possibility is that there's a God and God made it that way. That's where I land. The only other approach that makes any sense is to argue that there really is an infinite or a very big ensemble of universes out there, and we're in one of them. Now, as of 2021, there's absolute zero evidence for the multiverse. And guess what? In 3021, there won't be anyway either. Why? Because anything that we can observe is, guess what? Part of this universe. There's no working mathematical models to predict other universes right now. It can't ever be proven. So all it is a wish. It's a hope. Now, could it be true? Of course it can be true. God can create as many universes as he wants. There's no reason to believe we're the only universe that exists or the only people in this universe. God could do whatever he wants, but there's zero evidence for it. There's an outspoken atheist by the name of Richard Carrier, and he says you can't say the answer is God because God hasn't ever been seen and he can't be proven. And then he says, but there's a multiverse which can never be seen and can never be proven. It might be true, but it's just a blind faith, really. It's a hope. So is it possible? Sure. Any evidence for it? Not really. But here's the real problem with the multiverse. It doesn't solve the God problem. It doesn't solve the God problem. Think about the problems that atheism has to solve, the creation of the universe from nothing. Okay, if you have a multiverse generator, where did that come from? You have to go back in an infinite regress. You still have an uncaused first cause that they have not answered. Secondly, it doesn't solve the second law of thermodynamics. If the multiverse generator, whatever that is, had always existed, it would have burned out, and the universe or universes would all have burned out by now if they had always existed. So it doesn't answer that. And fine-tuning, think about this. Whatever generates a near infinite number of universes with all of these different conditions itself would have to be more finely tuned than the thing it's creating. So it doesn't even answer the fine-tuning problem. It just answers the fine-tuning of this universe. And does it replace religion? No, it is religion. It's a blind faith in something that could possibly be true, but there's no evidence for, and it can never be proven. Now, our friend Paul Davies, he has so many good quotes. Remember, he's an agnostic, and he said, criticism of the multiverse is that it isn't science, because it can't be tested by experiment or observation. He also said, multiverse theory hovers on the borderline between science and fantasy. And third, he says, once we're in the business of postulating entire other universes on flimsy evidence, where do we stop? And what does it do for our understanding of reality? He's an honest man. He doesn't believe in God, but he says, we can't just make stuff up. Now, you remember that guy, Frank Tipler? He was the guy that wrote the Anthropic Cosmological Principle and said, we become advanced enough to travel back in time and create our own universe. This is what he says today. When I began my career as a cosmologist some 20 years ago, I was a convinced atheist. I never in my wildest dreams imagined that one day I would be writing a book purporting to show that the central claims of the Judeo-Christian theology are in fact true, that these claims are straightforward deductions of the laws of physics as we now understand them. I have been forced into these conclusions by the inexorable logic by my own special branch of physics. How about that? So what do we conclude? We conclude Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Once again, science is our friend. And remember, I'm not cherry picking. I'm not quoting believers here. I'm quoting unbelievers giving us the facts to make our case. So you've got a second powerful, I think, irrefutable line of evidence that there is a God. So what do you need to remember? You're not going to remember everything I said here. What you need to remember is this. There are many, many constants in the universe and initial conditions of the universe that are so fine-tuned that they change the tiniest bit, there would be no life of any kind anywhere in the universe. And then you can look up and show your friends. All right. I'm going to save the questions for the end because I've got another about 12 minutes before we go to Q&A, so I'm going to start in on my next section. So we're skipping over questions for that section. Jot them down so you don't forget, and we'll talk about it. We want to talk about evidence from life on Earth. This is really, really cool. You know, people talk about the missing link, some ape man 200 million years ago. We're going to talk about the miracle of life, the miracle of the first life. Psalm 139 says, you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to life. When I talk about the miracle of life, I'm talking about the scientific impossibility of the first living organism coming into being by completely naturalistic chance processes. And by the time you leave today, or at least watch the end of this video, if you leave on time, you'll know the missing link isn't some knuckle-dragging ape man from 200,000 years ago. It's that very first tiny little cell. The first life appeared between 3.5 and 3.8 billion years ago. Scientists tell us they're in disagreement on when in there it was. Wait a minute, Joe. I learned in school that Darwin settled that. Doesn't evolution explain where life came from? The answer is no, because evolution doesn't even attempt to explain where life came from. Evolution explains how living things become more complex living things. It doesn't explain where life came from. There's some terms on there that you've probably read while I was talking. Evolution explains how a bacteria becomes a fish, that becomes a frog, that becomes a dog, that becomes a monkey, that becomes you. The idea that natural selection, that when your genes mutate, if you get a positive mutation, and then that gets into the genome, and over time, positive mutations stack up until more complex creatures come about. That's evolution. And now I just did a gross oversimplification of what evolution is, but you all studied it in school, and that'll suffice for today. Now, you have to understand that Darwin didn't even attempt to explain where life came from. In fact, he said it's mere rubbish to think of the origin of life. Why? Why didn't he try and answer that question? And the answer is he thought it was easy. He thought evolution was the hard part, that life was easy because, and they weren't dumb, they had bad microscopes back then. A cell looked like a circle with gray stuff inside. And so Thomas Huxley said the cell is a simple homogeneous globule of plasma, a plasm. And Ernest Haeckel, another world famous scientist, 46 years later, said the same thing. Picture a water balloon filled with grape jam, and you understand what they thought cells were like back in Darwin's day and until the early part of this century when we had better microscopes. They assumed that if you got the right chemicals together inside a membrane, that you had life. And so they figured that part's easy. Getting that to multiply and become you and me, that's the hard part. In reality, evolution is child's play compared to the first living organism. Now, I'm going to ask you, do not argue against evolution. I don't have time to talk about it now. You can bring it up in the Q&A if you like, and I could tell you why, but don't argue against evolution. There are many, first of all, it happened. People argue about how much it happened, but even young Earth creationists agree that evolution happens within species. People disagree of whether it explains all the variations of life, but you don't need that as evidence, and the Bible doesn't tell you you can't believe in evolution. God could use any mechanism he wants. He's a pretty smart God. Today, use other lines of evidence. Today, scientists talk about the first simple cell. That's like talking about a simple space shuttle. There's two questions we're going to have to answer here. How did life come from non-life, and how did information come from non-information? You've probably seen this cartoon, matter, life. In the middle, it says, then a miracle occurs. And he goes, I think you better be more explicit in step 2. So we're going to have the world's shortest biochemistry lesson, taking you back to high school. Smallest building blocks, well, actually, there are smaller things than atoms, but we're going to start at atoms. Atoms, the elements, hydrogen, oxygen, helium, carbon. And then molecules are atoms bonded together, H2O, water, NaCl, sodium chloride, salt. And then larger molecules are formed when smaller molecules get bonded together. Everything that you see and a lot of what you don't see is molecules. Amino acids are the building blocks for proteins. And we're going to talk a lot about proteins tonight. Proteins are very complex, three-dimensional chains of amino acids that do all the work in your body. And there are about 500 known amino acids in the universe. 50 of them are prevalent here on Earth, but only 20 of them can be in proteins. There's 20 amino acids that make up the proteins in you and me. If you only have 19 of them, you cannot make a protein. You cannot have life. All right, every living thing is made up of one or more cells. Your body, current estimate, is about 30 trillion cells. Now, What is a simple cell? Actually, there's no such thing as a simple cell. It is a factory in there. Please go out on YouTube and look at animations of what goes on inside a cell. It will blow your mind. But I'm going to dumb it down for this lesson to 5 things. A membrane. Picture a water balloon. And it's filled with 4 things. There's more than these 4, but these are the 4 most important. Proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, which are fats, and nucleic acids. You've heard of DNA and RNA. That's nucleic acids. Without those 5 things, you and I, or an amoeba, could never exist. So it has to have a selectively permeable membrane. Does anybody want to explain this picture? No, we're not going to. We're not going to try and explain it. It's very complicated. Just the membrane itself, here's what you need to know. Selectively permeable. It lets the good stuff in and lets the bad stuff out. Food can come in, waste can go out. Oxygen can come in, carbon dioxide can go out, and it keeps the bad stuff out and the good stuff in. Like your skin keeps all the good stuff inside of you and the bad stuff out. Same thing there. That's a selective permeable membrane. Picture the water balloon itself. All right. Now, this is for my wife, and she's actually in a ladies' class right now, but she's the one for me because my selectively permeable membrane let her in. This is where you're all supposed to go, aw. All right, so this is an E. coli, one of the simplest things on Earth, but it's not simple. It has 4,000 genes, which means it codes for 4,000 proteins and RNA. You don't need to know what that is. You and I have about 20,000 genes in our genome, in your DNA. But remember, we're trying to create the simplest cell. So the simplest cell that we know of on Earth today is this, the Mycoplasma genitalium. I won't tell you where it got its name, but it has only, and I put that in air quotes, 473 genes. And scientists today say they think they could pluck genes out of it and get it down to 382 genes, and it will still work. That's a lot of genes. That's a bunch of, and what genes do is they have the recipes for proteins and the recipes to make RNA, which you need to be alive. So let's say that the first cell 3.5 billion years ago was 1/4 as complex as this. Only 100 genes. 100 proteins have to be built to make that cell. We're going to give Dan Ziegler, I won't tell you who he is, I don't have time, but he ran a genetics lab for 35 years. He was also an old roommate of mine, one of the smartest people I've ever known up close. You've probably heard this. They've created life in the laboratory. That's absolutely bogus. We were taught in school about the Miller-Yuri experiment. These guys won the Nobel Prize for this. If you remember from high school. And if you don't, I'm going to tell you very briefly. They said, we want to recreate the early Earth, and they put ammonia, hydrogen, methane, and water vapor, zapped it with electricity, and they said, that's what the early Earth was like, electricity, lightning bolts hitting ponds, and it will create life. And what they created was some amino acids and a whole bunch of gunk, too. And Stanley Miller and his professor, Yuri, Harold Yuri, won the Nobel Prize for this. They said, we figured out how life was created on Earth. But did they? Was this a breakthrough in discovering how life began? Not even close. We don't have time to discuss what was wrong with their experiment and why it didn't match the early conditions of the universe. But textbooks still quote them today, even though scientists say it doesn't replicate the early Earth. And scientists say silly things like they created tiny pieces of DNA. That's factually wrong at so many levels, and this guy got a TV show. Another guy that had a TV show said this, the Miller-Urey experiment is now recognized as the single most significant step in convincing any scientist that life is likely to be abundant in the universe. Not only is it not true or a gross exaggeration, it's flat out false. Saying we've created life because we created amino acids is like saying, I found a piece of iron ore in my backyard, and so I know how cars build themselves. amino acids aren't even the building blocks for life. They're the building blocks of the building blocks for life. This is what our friend Paul Davies said. Saying they discovered how life began is like saying, I found a brick, so I know how the Empire State Building was constructed. All right. I'm going to go to 2 more quotes, and then we're going to get to a break and stop for Q&A. I'm going to skip Robert Shapiro's quote, but this is another agnostic evolutionary biologist, basically says it showed us nothing. Harold Yuri, Stanley Miller's advisor, the guy that won the Nobel Prize, this is what he said. All of us who study the origin of life find that the more we look into it, the more we feel it is too complex to have evolved anywhere. We all, and I want you to hear what he says here, we all believe as an article of faith that life evolved from dead matter on this planet. It's just that life's complexity is so great, it's hard for us to imagine that it did. He's an honest man. He says there's no way that life could have just happened, but we believe it anyways as an article of faith. All right. After we break, I'm going to talk about proteins, but you can take yourselves off of mute and let's have some questions and answers. Well, you'll have questions. You hope I have answers, or you wasted a little bit of time. And let me go ahead and stop sharing for the moment so I can see you guys better. Actually, you know what? I can see you just fine in these little boxes. I could do that. Here we go. Okay.
So, Joe, what are universities out there leaning towards for the answers that they can't find, as far as, like, for the fine tuning, and then it's pointing to intelligent design. What are those wild theories? What's the most popular?
The multiverse.
The multiverse. Okay.
Yeah, that's the one. There are other theories out there, and they're in my notes, but the scientists actually. Wait, are you saying for the fine tuning of the universe, or are you saying for life?
For both. I mean, yeah.
For the fine tuning of the universe, the multiverse. For life, they just say it happened. They don't actually address. Most scientists don't address some of the quotes that we saw. They continue. You have to understand, if you're a research scientist at a university, what do you need? Funding. You don't get funding saying we're not going to find answers. And so what they do is they do experiments. They'll take a little piece of the process. They will start with RNA in a sterile environment. They'll add one little thing, they'll tweak it, and they'll get one little subsequent step in the process and say, we've discovered something. But of course, what that really proves is intelligent design, that you can make something happen if you have a really smart research in a sterile environment. But it doesn't prove much for the origin of life. And the rest of the class, I'm going to get into some of those details as well that I didn't get to yet. But generally speaking, universities don't address it. They don't address those questions. And if you want to get a good grade, you don't ask those kind of questions in your class, unfortunately. Professors that question this are bullied out of their jobs, and students that question this more often than not don't get good grades. It's sad. If I had time, I could tell you, I've corresponded with some of these, again, famous scientists that lost their jobs because they brought some of these things up. In fact, one of the guys, I have a book that he wrote called The Privileged Planet. And I had sent him an email to ask him a question. He got a new job at a low-level college. It's almost like a community college or something, or a small university. And he said, please don't email me at this email address. I could lose my job. Here's my personal email address. He had already lost a job at another university for writing that book. We're seeing more and more, and I don't want to make a political statement, but we're noticed that free speech of Christians and of certain political views is censored today in many places, and the universities do more censorship than any place in the free world, American universities. It's and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm really not, but it's just a sad fact. Did that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay.
Thank you.
In fact, I would recommend Googling some of these guys that don't believe in God and they're evolutionary biologists, but they question Darwin, and see what other scientists write about them. A lot of ad hominem attacks. By the way, I have no problem with evolution. I'm fine if God, if everything from the very first bacterium to you and me was by evolution, I don't have a problem with that. I don't know if that's true or not, but it very well may be.
Would you say like most scientists, if they're on the political spectrum, would tend to be liberal? Well, universities.
No, I think in universities, yes.
Yes,
In
okay.
universities, yes, a strong liberal bent. But scientists in general are across the spectrum. They're just like you and me. They disbelieve at a higher rate because they're sort of brainwashed into that. If you grew up in the sciences and you go to college and you go to undergraduate and graduate school and all your professors are atheists and you're taught that it's dumb to believe, it's gonna take away your faith unless you had a very strong faith. But scientists in general are all over the spectrum.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So you brought up at the very beginning, Josh, barking up the wrong tree with certain apologetics that you would say are not worth getting into, and
yes,
one of them was Joshua and the Lost Day.
Yeah.
I guess what would be some other, like one or two other examples of topics that you would say are not, or apologetics that are not really well grounded or aren't worth really getting into?
You mean evidence that Christians sometimes give that actually are bogus?
Yeah.
I have quite a few of them in one of the chapters in my book. One, finding Noah's Ark. Oh gosh, I've got a bunch of them now. I'm going to blank.
How do you feel about the Shroud of Turin, for example?
That's a good question. I'll tell you, if you want to read someone who is a reasonable person who believes that the Shroud of Turin is a true artifact, Gary Habermas. He's not a quack. He actually thinks it's very possibly a genuine artifact. I'm skeptical. Here's what I think. In fact, Dan Ziegler, the guy that the geneticist that I quoted, said he has a theory that's not very scientific. He doesn't think God leaves stuff like that laying around. And what I've read a decent amount. It's an amazing artifact because the technology, if it was created in the 12th century, didn't exist. It's literally a photographic image of a crucified man or someone that looks just like a crucified man. There's a lot of things that would make you go, However, the tests seem to show it came from the 12th century. It might go back. So could it be true? Sure. My hunch is God doesn't want us to know what Jesus looked like because I think we would start worshiping an image, but I don't have an answer for it. It really is an amazing artifact. The image is like not even the thickness of one of the threads. It's like radiation went through the body and hit onto the cloth. It's really crazy. So who knows? But Gary Habermas would be the person that I would query his stuff on the shroud if you want to get something that's fairly even-handed.
Cool. Thank you.
It'd be neat if it was true, but it doesn't make people. It won't make people believe. If we had a picture of, if we found the ark with a picture of Noah, his wife, and all the animals, people still wouldn't believe.
True. Are there any other questions for Joe? Cool. Well, if there are no other questions, that was definitely very helpful, Joe. Really appreciate it. As he said at the beginning, he's going to just continue on with the recording because he does have more material. But, now's the time when, if you need to go, feel free to sign off because, we're out of time. But if you want to stay on, you're also more than welcome. So or if you want to visit the recording at a later time and listen to it, feel free. So maybe if I could just have someone close us out in prayer. You might hear construction sounds in the background. It's my 2-year-old playing away. So if someone doesn't mind just closing us out with a quick prayer, that'd be awesome.
I could do that. I have a quick question too, Joe.
Yeah.
Are you sending us these PowerPoint slides you said?
Yes,
gonna
I
send it to
apologize. I
email?
didn't do it last week. I will send them. I have everybody's email. I'll send them out. I'll send out the PowerPoints and notes, and also uh, finished chapters in my book too. So yeah,
Awesome.
I didn't get to it last week, and I need to make the time to take the time to make that. I kind of have to clean them up sometimes before I send them out. But I'll
Okay.
get that this week. Thanks.
All right. Yep. Look forward to that. Okay. Let's go to God in prayer. Lord God Almighty, we're grateful, Father God, just for you and how you just designed this this earth and the universe. And Father God, you are way smarter than us, and we're glad you're sovereign, and we're just thankful for the opportunity to worship you. And thank you for Joe. Thank you for these lessons. They are faith building. My prayer is that we may be able to understand it, or myself to understand it to the point where I can explain it to others that are questioning or atheists or agnostic, and to the point where I don't get myself in trouble, but Lord, just really win some over perhaps. But also, I think this would be awesome for disciples to just really strengthen their resolve and their convictions. And Father, I pray that many people that don't have or are not taking this class will get their hands on these recordings and notes. And Father, we just thank you for this format and setting this up. And we know that everything happens for your glory and your purpose. And we thank you in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, brother. All right. For those of you who are cutting out, we'll see you next week. And I hope at least one person stays, so I'm not talking to myself. But let me share my screen again and get back to the PowerPoint. Click share screen. And there we go, screen 3. All right. And you should be able to see that. Okay, so proteins. Let's talk about proteins. Why all the emphasis on amino acids? And it's because we need them for protein. The most important part of your cells is the protein, because they do all the work. And if we have no amino acids, we can't build proteins. No proteins, no you and me. They're essential to life. Now, even the simplest living organism has more than 400 different types of proteins. There's 20,000 proteins, different types of proteins in you and me. So let's start with something easy. Let's forget. Okay, come on, let's go. There we go. Something easy. Forget 100 proteins. Let's see if we can create one protein. What would it take? Well, a typical protein is a chain of several hundred amino acids linked together, bonded together in a chemical reaction. The largest protein that has been discovered is called titin, and it's found in your muscles. It has a chain of 32,000 amino acids. But to create a protein, you have to have the right amino acids in the exact right order, or you can't build the protein. So we'll take a very simple protein of only 100 amino acids in a chain. Imagine those little plastic blocks that your kids stick together. You can picture that. So what would it take to make that simple 100 amino acid chain protein? Well, let's give our atheistic friends the benefit of the doubt. Let's take Darwin's warm pond that he had hoped for, and we're going to fill it with tons and tons and tons of the 20 essential amino acids. Remember, there's 50 amino acids on Earth. We're going to get the other 30. They're not even allowed in the pond. Only the 20 amino acids are allowed in our pond. And none, so we only have the good stuff there. Again, we're stacking the deck that would not have been the case in the early world. What do you need? Well, number one, you have to get the right amino acid. The right one of the 20 has to go in spot number 1. That's a 1 in 20 chance, 5%. Secondly, you have to have the right chirality. What does chirality mean? It means there's a right-handed version of every amino acid and a left-handed version of every amino acid. And only left-handed amino acids, will make proteins. Now, there's no reason you couldn't have a protein made with all right-handed amino acids, except there are none on planet Earth. Maybe it could have been that way, but you can't mix them. So every protein that has ever been discovered is all left-handed amino acids. 1 in 2 chance, 50-50. Third, you need a peptide bond. To get those 2 amino acids to stick together, there has to be a peptide bond. It's a chemistry thing. And about half of the connections can make a peptide bond, so you got a 50-50 shot there. So what's the odds of your first link coming together if amino acids are bouncing into each other? It's 0.05 times 0.5 times 0.5, or 1.25%. So in your first bounce, you have a 1.25% of any 2 of these 20 amino acids bouncing the right 2 together. All right, now we want to do that 100 times in a row. If you remember your math, you get 0.0125 to the 100th power, or multiply it by itself 100 times, and you come up with that number there on a screen, 4.9 times 10 to the negative 191st power. What does that mean? You've got a decimal point, 191 zeros, or 190 zeros, and then a 4 and a 9. So that's the odds of getting 100 collisions together to work to make that one protein of 100 amino acids long. Well, let's stack the odds in favor of that happening. Let's assume that in our pond there are 1 billion collisions per second between amino acids, and that happens for 1 billion years. And if you do the math, that's 3.15 times 10 to the 25th total collisions in our billion-year time period at 1 billion per second. And we're not going to say it's just going to make this one protein. We know there's about 10 million different proteins in the world. We're going to say if it made any of those proteins, and we're going to, even though most of them are longer than 100, we're just going to say they're 100 for the sake of the math. The chance of making any one of the 10 million proteins in those perfect conditions is still 1 chance in 10 to the 159th power. That's the odds of winning the Powerball. "19 weeks in a row." That's the odds of just coming up with one simple protein, not the 100 that we need, and really we probably need 300 for a simple cell, but we imagined a simple cell with only 100. So you have to win the lottery 19 weeks in a row just to come up with one protein molecule. That's not life. That's just one protein molecule. Now it needs to find 100 other friends and gather together and squeeze inside of a membrane somehow. And still, that wouldn't be life, would it? 100 proteins inside a membrane. So to say that this happened by accident is not just bad science, it's bad religion. It takes more faith to believe that happened than to say God put it together. We've mentioned Fred Hoyle before, and he said the chance of obtaining even one functioning protein by chance is the equivalent of a star system full of blind men solving Rubik's Cube simultaneously. In other words, he says it's impossible. That's just to get one protein molecule. And a chain of 100 amino acids in a row, even if they're the right ones in the right order, still isn't a protein. It's not a protein until it's folded into the correct shape. And guess where that happens? Inside living cells. We've got a real chicken and an egg problem. So one protein is impossible. And even if we had it, it's not life any more than one little piece of glass is an automobile. So to get to our simple cell with only 100 proteins, we need the impossible to happen 100 times in the exact same tiny little spot where they can all come together. And even that isn't a living cell. Do you see the impossibility of this happening by chance? It's impossible. Now, let's talk about one more thing. You've probably seen this before. You know what that is? Hey, you guys can take yourself off mute and talk back to me. It's only the 3 of us now, or the 4 of us. What is that?
DNA.
It is DNA. That's right, deoxyribonucleic acid. Why is it important? It's where all of the instructions for how to put you together live. Men usually use sports illustrations, and non-sports fans complain that they can't relate. So I'm going to use two illustrations for non-sports fans. One, a computer, and two, a kitchen, a cookbook, baking a cake. So what is DNA? It's basically what makes my kids look like me and your kids look like you. But it's a lot more than that. It is essential for life. It tells you and your cells how to replicate. In a kitchen illustration, the DNA is the cookbook. Every page has a recipe. Well, DNA on those little rungs of the DNA that's spinning around are nucleic acids that spell out the recipes to build proteins. Thousands and thousands of proteins. Or if you're a computer geek, forget the cookbook. It's a hard drive. DNA is the hard drive, and on the hard drive is the information of how to build people. Now, here's the chicken and egg problem. You need proteins to build DNA, and you need DNA to build proteins. DNA is the recipe to build proteins, and proteins in the cell put the DNA together. So, here's the problem we have with nature. Nature can create order, right? The solar system is very ordered. A crystal, a snowflake. They're high in order, low in information. But what nature cannot do is it cannot create information. Now, DNA is super complex as a molecule, and each strand contains millions of bits of information, a complex computer program. And on top of that, DNA is self-replicating. It creates more copies of itself. That's pretty complicated too. Now, as complicated as this molecule is, and this is an oversimplified drawing of it, the information it contains is even more complicated because, in fact, Bill Gates said DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software ever created. He's an atheist as well. Now, we've already demonstrated with science and math that it's impossible for nature to randomly create one single protein molecule. How much more impossible is it to create the computer with all the recipes for all the protein molecules? You would have to have a very smart entity putting that together. If you can't get one protein, you can't get the recipe for the protein or the recipe for all the proteins. Look, I've made my living in IT for 40 years, and I can tell you, if we could get computers to program themselves, we would have saved a lot of money not hiring programmers. One of the basic laws of information science is that information always comes from intelligence, not from non-information. Now, we're going to skip these next two slides, but these are slides by guys that proposed how life could have come about on its own. We just don't have time. So I want to talk about information for a minute. Now, you've probably had those little magnetic letters on your fridge at some time in your life. Imagine I grabbed 15 of them. I grabbed these 15 letters and I threw them in my refrigerator and they spelled this: Fern is beautiful. Well, that would be a true statement. Fern is my wife. She is very beautiful. And someone says, wow, how did that happen? I would say magnetism. They go, no, magnetism is what made them stick to the fridge. What put them in that order? Magnetism. No, it didn't. I put them in that order. So I throw them at the fridge again, and I get Luis ruined beef fat. I don't know who Louis is. I don't know how you can ruin beef fat. I throw them again, and I get I rub feet in Florida, USA. Okay, I don't know what that means. I don't want to know. But most of the time, 99.9999999% of the time, you're going to get something like this. You're going to get gibberish because there's 1.3 trillion combinations of those 15 magnetic letters that I grabbed out of my kid's toy box. You can explain through the principles of magnetism why they stick, but you can't explain how they got in that order. You can explain through the principles of attraction why the molecules stick to each other. You cannot explain the information that they contain. That's the problem scientists have with explaining DNA. Dr. Lynn Margulies, who should have won the Nobel Prize, she still might, she's dead now, because everybody thought that some of her science was bogus and it turned out to be true. But she said to go from a bacterium to people is less of a step than to go from a mixture of amino acids to a bacterium. And what I've shown you is true. Once you have a bacterium, evolution is a process that is least possible that could eventually get to you and me. There is no mechanism, there is no process to get from a bunch of amino acids to a living cell. And she's honest enough to admit that. All right. See, evolution doesn't answer the question because, as we said early, evolution, well, we didn't say this earlier. People say evolution did it. Evolution doesn't even start to work until after you have a living cell. If you don't have a living cell, there's nothing to evolve. Living organisms can evolve. Chemicals cannot evolve. Chemicals can only react. That's all chemicals can do. A sodium chloride, salt, is not going to turn into something else. It's going to follow the principles of chemistry. See, the very missing link is that first link, all the way back then. Now, let's get oh, I had a quote. Did I skip? Okay, I'm a little out of order on. Wait, did I just skip Fred Hoyle? There he is. Okay. This is what Fred Hoyle again. Once again, an atheist till the day he died. He said a junkyard contains all the bits and pieces of a 747 dismembered in disarray. A whirlwind happens to blow through the yard. What's the chance that after its passage, a fully assembled 747 ready to fly will be found standing there? So small as to be negligible, even if a tornado were to blow through enough junkyards to fill the whole universe. In other words, he's saying it's more likely for a tornado to go through a junkyard and when it goes through, create a 747 that's ready to fly than it is for one living cell to happen by chance. And he said the odds are 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000. Paul Davies, who we've quoted before, came up with that same number, 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000. I don't know how they calculated it. Those are long odds. Why? Why are the odds so long? Because we already talked about this. A simple cell isn't simple. You have many, many, many different proteins, and we can't even come up with one. You need the cell membrane, selectively permeable, to let the good stuff in and keep the bad stuff out. You need the instructions to build all those proteins and build the RNA and to build the cell membranes and to build everything else. Plus, we didn't even talk about lipids, carbohydrates. And a cell has to be able to eat, right? It has to take in some sort of nutrition for energy and expel waste. Even if that energy comes from the sun, it still has to have a mechanism to do that, right? And then there has to be a factory to build the proteins. Something in the cell has to grab amino acids and stick them in that order. And then it has to be able to reproduce, make another copy of itself. If the first living cell came together by accident and didn't know how to reproduce, there wouldn't have been a second cell. We have one intractable problem after another, none of which there's a naturalistic explanation for. So what's the atheist answer? And as the brother asked earlier, well, once again, we've got God and chance, and then throw out some theories. They don't like the God. The most popular of the theory today is the RNA world. We're not going to talk about these other theories. There aren't time, and most scientists don't like them anyways. RNA world basically says that, okay, we give up on DNA. It's obviously too complicated. It wasn't there for the first cell. The first cell was built on RNA. Well, there's some problems with RNA world. You have a chicken and egg problem like I talked about before. You need proteins to create RNA. RNA is created by proteins. You can't just go down to RNA or us and buy some RNA 3.5 billion years ago. Well, they say, well, the RNA was the chicken and the egg. The RNA built itself so it could build proteins. And they say that it has evolutionary properties, that it replicates itself and evolves, which doesn't make any sense. So what's wrong with that theory? we're not going to talk about what's wrong with the theory because I'm going to simplify it for you. There's all these different scientific reasons why it's a bad theory. But I want to quote Eugene Koonin. He is a origin of life researcher, a biologist, and he said he was reviewing somebody's doctoral thesis on the RNA world, and he said the RNA world scenario is bad as a scientific hypothesis. Then he explains why it's bad, and he concludes, nevertheless, there's a whole lot going for the RNA world, whereas the other hypotheses on the origin of life are outright helpless. In other words, he says it's a bad theory, but all the others are worse, so I'm picking this one. Now, if that's your best science, may God have mercy on your research. Now, there's another theory. Here is Francis Crick, the guy who discovered how the DNA double helix work. He got the Nobel Prize for it. He's an atheist. He said it may turn out that we'll eventually be able to see how this RNA world got started. At present, the gap from the primal soup to the first RNA system capable of natural selection looks forbiddingly wide. He also said, an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. But he doesn't believe it's a miracle. He doesn't believe in God. He believes it happened. But he's smart enough to know it clearly couldn't have happened here on Earth. So they proposed something called Panspermia. What is Panspermia? Pan means the universe. Spermia means to generate life. You recognize the word and the root of that. They believe that ET planted life here on Earth. There's two types of panspermia. Directed, ET came here on purpose and planted life, or sent a spaceship with it here so it would grow here on Earth. Undirected panspermia means there was a microbe, like a bacteria, inside a meteorite that flew for 1 million years through space, landed in a fiery crash on Earth, broke out of that meteorite, and then started multiplying on Earth. Now, let's see what Crick said here. An honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us. Oh, I already read that, didn't I? Ha ha. Here we go. It takes more faith to believe in panspermia than to believe that God created life. Now, Fred Hoyle also believed in panspermia because he was an atheist. He had to come up with something. Leslie Orgel, there are a number of scientists now that are clinging to panspermia because they're giving up on there being a chance that Earth could have created life by 3.5 billion years ago. Now, the main problem with panspermia is not how unlikely it is that ET came here and planted it, or that a microbe could survive 1 million years inside a rock going through space at near absolute zero, and then having a fiery crash on Earth. I'm willing to concede that's possible. It's not very. Here's the real problem. You haven't solved the problem. Because no matter what planet ET came from, they have the same problem of how did life get started there? Still, you would have had to have DNA, RNA, amino acids, proteins. If the life there is like the life here, and it must be because it came from there, they have the same intractable problems. You haven't solved the problem. You've just closed your eyes and said it just came from someplace else. Everything we talked about tonight, the fine-tuned universe, the impossibility of proteins occurring by chance, the incredibly complex DNA molecule, all of the things that go into the simplest cell, every one of those challenges would happen on any planet in the universe. ET can't bring life here because ET didn't have a way to start either. So let's forget all the origin of life research. Let's create life the easy way, right? Let's take a perfect environment with all the right chemicals, put it at the right temperature in a sterile lab, and then put a single cell creature in there. something that's already alive, which means it has everything you need for life. Poke it with a pin, and that stuff will go out into that thing and see if it reassembles into a living creature. But we know what will happen, and so does every scientist, which is why they don't do this experiment. It will die, and it won't create new life. You have everything you need, and poking it kills it, doesn't make it create life. So they say time's the answer. Nobel Prize winner George Wald said time itself performs the miracle, as if that made the impossible more likely. And they say, well, 100 chimps at 100 typewriters in 100 years could create the works of Shakespeare. Actually, you can do the math. That's absolute nonsense. There's 800,000 words in Shakespeare. You can't even get a calculator that'll calculate the number of possibilities that are there. In fact, if you had 1 trillion monkeys at 1 trillion typewriters typing 1 letter per second from the time of the Big Bang until today, they would not be able to type the first line of Shakespeare's 76th sonnet. These ideas that you can just throw numbers out there like, well, the number's time. It doesn't, you have to do the math. By the way, some researchers in England tried this. They had 6 monkeys. They didn't have 100. They gave them typewriters, and they were in for, I think it was a week. They didn't type a single word. All they did was defecate on the typewriters and bang them with rocks. So that experiment probably won't work. So let's bring this plane in for a landing. Here's what the smartest origin of life researchers in the world conclude. Fred Hoyle and Paul Davies said the odds are 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power that you'd ever get one cell. And Hoyle said, in short, there's not a shred of objective evidence to support the hypothesis that life began in organic soup on Earth. Richard Dawkins said nobody knows. Harold Morowitz, he's no friend of believers. He's not only an atheist, he testified against intelligent design being taught in school, in court. He says there's no scientific basis for it. He's one of the foremost origin of life researchers of the 20th century, and he said this: the chance of life arising by chance is 1 in 10 to the 100 billionth power. So apparently, Hoyle and Davies are optimists compared to him, and yet he believes that there's no God. And then Robert Shapiro said would be waiting for a miracle. We'll skip that quote. Ken Nielsen says nobody understands the origin of life. If they say they do, they're trying to fool you. Ed Pelser, this is the only non-atheist or agnostic that I quote here, has a great quote. He says, at worst, it's a lie we tell ourselves, and at best, it's a myth. Antony Flew was perhaps the top atheist philosopher of the 20th century in the English-speaking world. He wrote many, many books, debated many believers, usually beat him up. He was a really, really smart guy. And at the end of his life, later in life, he wrote a book called There Is a God, /No. He became a believer. Not a Christian, but a believer in God. He said the most impressive arguments for God's existence are those that are supported by recent scientific discoveries. And he said the argument to intelligent design is enormously stronger than when I first met it. By the way, that guy whose quote that we skimmed by, Ed Pelser, he worked with Stanley Miller on an experiment, and he also got to handle and work with the Miller-Urey results. This is no slouch. But he said, Flew also said, my one and only piece of relevant evidence for God is the apparent impossibility of providing a naturalistic theory of the origin from DNA of the first reproducing species. And he says that's why he believes now in a first cause God. He also wrote that the latest work I've seen shows that the present physical universe gives too little time for these theories of abiogenesis to get the job done. How can a universe of mindless matter produce beings with intrinsic ends, self-replication capabilities, and coded chemistry? This is a guy you have to understand that was the most famous atheist in the world. But the reason he changed is he says, I've always followed the policy of Socrates. We have to follow the argument wherever it leads. And then he also said he had grown in empathy with the insight of Einstein and the other scientists that said there had to be an intelligence behind the integrated complexity of the physical universe, and my own insight that the integrated complexity of life itself, which is far more complex than the physical universe, can only be explained by an intelligent source. So, he actually joined 11 academics in Britain and urged them to start teaching intelligence design in the state schools. Now, he didn't become a Christian, but he had to face the evidence and said, you know what? I can't say that there's no God anymore. I have to check my brain. I have to accept the evidence. So why don't people believe? Well, I used to skydive. I have 11 jumps. Funnest thing I ever did. And I've heard that the odds of surviving a jump from 10,000 feet without a parachute are 1 in 10 million. So I'd like to share with my atheistic friends, make you a deal. You jump without a parachute. 10 million, I'll give you 10 million to 1 odds. If you survive, I'll give you $10 million. And if you die, I only get $1 from your estate. Fair enough? I haven't had a taker yet, and I'm not going to. And yet, atheists are betting their lives, their eternal lives, on odds not 1 million to 1, 10 to the 159th to 1, 10 to the 40,000th power to 1, 10 to the 10 billionth to 1. See, you're much more likely to survive a jump without a parachute than you are to have any of these naturalistic explanations of life without God be true. See, our faith is not unreasonable. Our faith is very, very reasonable. And that's why I'm not an atheist anymore. I was an atheist when I got to college, and I thought it was dumb to believe in God. Now I think it's dumb not to. Now, the evidence is overwhelming. So why don't people believe then? There's really only 2 reasons. One, they haven't ever examined the evidence. But I think the second reason is the more common one. It was the reason I didn't believe. They don't want to. I got a little behind on my slides. I just didn't want to believe. I had no strong reasons not to. I wasn't antagonistic toward God. It just didn't seem to fit into my life. So our friend George Wald, who said time performs the miracle, this guy won a Nobel Prize. He said this, and he's an honest man here, and I appreciate this. He says there's only 2 possibilities as to how life arose. One is spontaneous generation arising to evolution. The other is a supernatural creative act of God. There is no third possibility. Spontaneous generation, the life arose from non-living matter, was scientifically disproved 120 years ago by Louis Pasteur and others. That leaves us only with the only possible conclusion that life arose as a supernatural creative act by God. I will not accept that philosophically because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible, spontaneous generational life. That's an honest man. It's sad. He so much didn't want to believe in God, he says, I'm going to believe the impossible because I don't want to believe in God. Fred Hoyle's conclusion in his book, Fred Hoyle's Universe, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts, seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. He's an atheist, but at least he was honest. So what do we conclude? The most logical to answer to all of this scientific evidence is that God created the universe and God created life. How did he do it? We don't know. But he did it. There's a highly organized universe with a creator. Science is our friend. And God said centuries ago, God created the heavens and the earth, and God created everything in it. Science is helping prove that for us today. Yes, life is a miracle, but God is behind it all. And however he did it, it's amazing. God created the heavens and the earth, and it was mind-bogglingly good. That's the end of this presentation. Thanks for sticking around. Did you guys have any more questions? I know it's late. All right, I'm going to end the recording now. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you next week.